I am Linnea Caps. I am also sometimes known as Literal Grail, and I am your current Furry Writers Guild president. We return to my original comfy place of, well, basically on my bed because it's got this clean backdrop. And today we're going to be talking, at least in this first panel, I have a bit in a row here, about marketing your furry stories to non-furry audiences. Because I'm starting to notice something when I am looking at furry things. People think that only furries want to read furry stories. This is such a small thing to be, I don't want to say annoyed, because that's not correct. I'm just going to zoom in here. This is a serious conversation. To be annoyed by this tiny piece of hair that won't cooperate. But no, when going to market my latest book, What Makes a Witch, I noticed something. Of course, I wrote furry characters because I love furries. What a surprise. But these anthropomorphic characters, why couldn't I just have anyone read this book? Now, this isn't always going to be the case. If you're writing strictly hard, furry smut, you may have a slightly more difficult time trying to, market this to your mainstream audience. Is it impossible? No. We'll talk about that in a little bit, probably near the end, very briefly. But when I went to market this, and I have a panel on this afterwards about how to market your books on podcasts, by the way, just so you know, I found when I told people that I was a furry and this was a furry book, that my marketability went up. It's not the other way around. When I was like, oh yeah, I'm the furry writer, I do this thing for the Furry Writers Guild, people wanted more interviews. More people became interested in my fantasy book featuring anthropomorphic animals the moment they knew I was a furry. And it basically marked upon me a realization. It's awesome that we're selling books at conventions. And yes, there's always going to be things a little too niche to probably hit the mainstream audience very well. But we need to be less afraid of marketing our furry books to mainstream audiences so that we can make more sales, possibly convert more furry readers, and just in general, build your name as an author. I know that a lot of authors within the furry fandom do this as a hobby and something that is fun. And I know that, I am also personally part of that. I also like to write for other publications and things, but a lot of my published stories in furry are things that I wrote just for fun. Why not find ways to make it so that everyone will? And I want to discuss a little bit on how you can do that today. And of course, my eyes are on the chat. So if you have questions at any time, ask them and we will go off on tangents. The first thing that I want to tell you all about marketing your stories to mainstream audiences. If you have written a science fiction or fantasy story, the SFWA, whether you're a member or not, will allow you to put your books up on NetGalley for a small fee. Normally, this costs something like $600 to run a regular NetGalley account. That is not affordable for most people. However, I actually took the risk. I put in a little bit of cash, not the full 600, but because of the SFWA and I had a fantasy story. I put it up and said, let's see if I can actually get some reviews. I am definitely a furry author, but let's see if the average everyday person on NetGalley will put reviews on Amazon, put reviews wherever. And guess what happened? I got reviews. Like, as everyone talks about this, how book reviews are so important to the success of your book. Even in a niche market, this can be very helpful for us. But a lot of people would say we're so niche that it's not as big of a deal, but that's the thing. We can market to a bigger audience. Furry is a wonderful built-in audience for any anthropomorphic novel, but if you guys have seen Zootopia, how many of you have seen Redwall? How many of you have seen The Secret of Nim? People like anthropomorphic animals, and a majority of the stories that we are writing do not need to only be marketed to those audiences. It's easier to market it to those audiences, but we don't have to. And I wasn't expecting people to pick up my book and even give it a review. I figured, this is money down the drain for a good experiment for the guild. And then it worked, which is part of what inspired this. So that's a first step for everyone. If you have a science fiction or fantasy story, the SFWA will help you on that. You can look up their program. You do not have to be a member of the SFWA. And believe me, the Furry Writers Guild is looking into how we could provide a similar service. It's just a budget thing. But we're seeing what we can do. to try to make that happen. Potentially a next year project. Let's see how it goes. The second major thing that you can do, go and do the actual blog interviews and everything else for your book. Don't be afraid because you're a furry book that another blog or anything else won't actually take you on. Now, I know nowadays that blog tours aren't as strong as they used to be for books, and you can just pay people to do these very soulless blog tours. That's not what I mean. If you're trying to put out a brand new book, whether it's through a publisher or not, especially as we're a niche fandom without a huge marketing presence, that's going to be on you to try to pull this off. Go and look up blogs that discuss the kinds of topics you're writing about. I have said this many times, and we have a recommended reading list on the Furry Writers Guild website, but furry itself is not really a genre. I mean, I can understand why that may be a controversial statement, but we are writing furry stories in sci-fi. We are writing furry stories in contemporary. We are writing these stories, and they can still be marketed in those situations. So in my case, I went out and found fantasy bloggers, and I found some fantasy podcasts, or even just general podcasts on writing, that any of them that would take me. And I said, "Hi, I am a furry writer. Would you like to talk about my book?" And I made that a frontmost forefront part of my pitch. Not that anthropomorphic animals don't just sell in general, but guys, guess what? We're in a world where furry is mainstream enough that it can be a selling point. It can be that, well, this is the interesting thing that brings people onto my blog or gets them to listen. And it worked. It absolutely worked. And it's going to sound weird, but you can lean into the furry side of things, and it's going to help you market with a mainstream audience. It's not going to work out everybody, but some people, that's going to be the part that gets them really curious and gets them to check out the book. So don't be afraid. My next general tip from having discovered all of these different things is we're going to talk about podcasts here in the next half hour, and I'm going to specifically discuss that process. But if you can get on a podcast or do anything else, once again, do not be afraid of basically hyping up the furry side of things because it's kind of wonderful. uh, People in general are going to want to talk about this topic. It's interesting. You can talk about why you chose the species of animal for this story, or is there a prey predator dynamic in your story? These are things that people are really honestly going to be interested in the mainstream audience because, unlike us furries, they don't see this as much as a topic. They saw Zootopia, they saw Prey versus Predator. They don't know how far this can go, basically. So there's really amazing things that you can do to open this up to others. I'm also going to say there's some different tips for if you're working with self-publishing versus if you're working for one of our awesome publishers within the fandom. I'm going to, I'm going to tell everyone right now we have amazing publishers within the fandom. I've got to do a little bit of work with basically all of them. Just absolutely incredible. When they have submissions open, please, please feel free to submit to them. But if you have a story that you really think is like, this is really just a story with some anthro animals, but this mainstream audience, they could really be into it. Don't be afraid to submit it to that one publisher who's looking for these stories. I've managed to get published in a couple of more mainstream publications with stories that I definitely would have thought I would be submitting to the local furry anthology because people want to read them. And I'm finding this, I don't want to say this is a weakness of our current publishing standards within the fandom, but I honestly think it is that we have this wonderful built-in niche market, which is great and definitely helps sell books and keeps us floating. Even though, again, of course, it's very difficult for most authors to make that big break and do that. But we need to start selling in other places too and starting trying to promote things. I mean, my book, all of my reviewers said this is great middle grade fiction. So I started going out and getting reviews and discussing things with it as a middle grade novel, not just a furry novel. And it worked. And I see a good comment here. A lot of people grew up with furry adjacent literature, so I have to imagine that it stokes curiosity far outside the fandom. Kizek, you are absolutely correct. One of the books that I loved the most as a child is a book called Cat Wings. It's a four-book little series of books, and I should have known I'd grow up to be a furry, but here we are. But as you can see, a book which is literally about essentially anthropomorphic cats with human abilities for thinking, with wings, which sounds like a sparkle dog fantasy in furry, sold so many books that it's still in print today, even though the author is no longer alive and continues selling. So, your furry books, they can go further than just the furry fandom. And there are plenty of other resources. There are a few places out there and specific websites. I'll see if I can manage to grab some links where you can specifically try to find blogs that are interested in doing book reviews. Although, if you basically put it into Google, you're going to find two or three results for these sites that essentially aggregate book review blogs. They're not always going to be easy to find, but they're out there and exist. You can also hit up the Bookstagram community, although to be fair, the Bookstagram community tends to require physical books. So this is not going to be a great pre-marketing strategy for your novel. You're probably going to have to do this as an after, but people are going to see that, and especially on something like Instagram, how do separate yourself from all the other people doing this exact thing you're doing? Pitch it to them. You're going to cover the book about furries, and that's going to draw them in. I think I think in general too, one of the most wonderful articles I wrote back in my brief career writing esports articles, which yes, that's part of how I started writing. I was writing things for competitive video games. Was the one time I went to a furry convention that was hosted alongside one of the largest video game tournaments in the world, same building, same venue, and I reported on my experiences at that convention. That is still to date in the top three most viewed articles that I have ever written during that period of time. You can point to things like this and go, hey, when you guys talk about furries, look how good it does. Or go to the Daily Dot, which has had several wonderful articles on furries, some of them written by an FWG member now, Anna Valens, who is marvelous. Um, those articles, she's pitching them to a mainstream magazine publisher. And they want to publish them. Why? Because they're furry. So don't be afraid to be like, hey, we've got this book review, or this thing is coming out, and we want to talk about it to a mainstream publisher. Because I was hoping it could come out before the convention, but of course there's also time restraints. But I also had actually another mainstream magazine come to interview me specifically because I was a furry author who put out a book. They reached out to me, and I want to make sure that that next book you're writing, you're not afraid to put it out there for another major things. Yes, FurCon a few years ago. Thank you for noticing that, Fuzzwolf, on that comment. Yes, they had a furry convention alongside Genesis 3, the world's largest Smash Brothers tournament at the time. And I went and reported on that tournament, and that's what brought me into the fandom in the first place. But it again was still, and probably still is, one of the most read things that I have ever written in my career. People in the mainstream world are ready for furry lit. People are ready for you to go on places like, oh, what is it called? Of course, my brain's going to forget. Goodreads. There are groups on Goodreads where you can work with other authors to get reviews on your books. If you're going to do this, I mean, please also offer to do reviews for their other books. We're niche and small, like people. We're trying to all build each other up. Don't just go in there, get your review, and run away. But there are tons of groups on there, and it doesn't matter if your book is furry or not. If you put it in there, people are going to potentially read it, give you reviews. It may not be perfect, but these things exist. There's also lots of other programs out there. There's Voracious Readers, which also secured me several reviews for my book, which was awesome. There's a library thing where you can give away virtual copies of your book for reviews before the book comes out. Several reviews there too, and none of these are furry websites, and none of these had a furry focus. You can go and look at maybe not all traditional models of advertising for your book. Again, we do have a wonderful built-in audience. I'm not saying ignore the furries because obviously we're probably more likely to pick up your book on animals than anybody else. But if you sit down and you take some traditional publishing advice of get reviews on this website, get reviews on that website, what should you do as a self-published author? How do you get a book blog tour going? Which I recommend the book blog tour. I do not recommend paying for a service of a book blog tour. I've seen how those go. They're especially paid services these days are pretty soulless and they're not very exciting. Those kinds of reviews are not the kinds of things that you would read and then actually want to purchase the book. It's unfortunate. But these things all can still exist and work for you. And hey, you want to know what your local newspaper will want to report about? If you're brave about that, I understand that everyone wants the world to know they're a furry. You can tell them, I just wrote a book and I'm a local author. Would you like to cover this as an article? Oh, by the way, I'm a furry. And that newspaper is probably going to pick it up immediately because that's going to get them some very interested readers. It's something that I did as well, and I still have the clipping from my newspaper where I grew up as a child talking about the book I wrote and how I'm a furry, which is marvelous. But all of these traditional pieces of advice are things that we can actually do as authors, and we don't have to be afraid of it even though we're furries. Although, again, to be fair, all of this advice comes with the caveat and side note. If you're not ready for the whole world to know you're a furry, that's very okay. I understand that plenty of people have their personas as a thing, and then they have their public lives or public personas, or some people just use their pen names. But I literally know of an FWG member that uses their pen name as part of their college courses that they teach on writing because that's the name they're published under as an author. So I don't want people to be afraid that being a furry is such a thing. It's literally a way to bring your books into an even further and higher market. And also, just because I can't help myself in the comments, thank you, I love my hair. If anyone has any general questions, let me know. I'm going to let everybody know that some of these main resources are going to be put on the Furry Writers Guild blog at some point in the near future as a general guide and tutorial, because I understand that not everyone knows all of these websites and all of these groups and everything that I've been, rattling off. And I can tell you right now to go to Google and you can find some very wonderful resources, but of course, these things are also difficult. On our guild website, if you go to the Furry Writers Market and check out self-publishing resources, you can also find a few of these resources listed there, alongside some editors that you can hire within the fandom and other wonderful things. So I hope that some of these things are really useful and really helpful. I will take again just another minute to make sure we don't have any particular questions on trying to market your furry works to mainstream audiences, because after that, I can literally jump right into another marketing panel about how to work with podcasts and what that experience is like. I'm very glad these were scheduled so close together because they're both very intertwining. But I'm not seeing any big questions. I don't have to go on break. I don't have to play the beautiful music as much as I loved Cassidy Sivet's panel last night. Ooh, I see a thing. So it's a generally bad idea to pay for publicity. And what should you really be doing is thinking of creative ways to market and put time into them. This is a wonderful, wonderful question. There are definitely some paid ways to advertise yourself that you should consider. A lot of them, though, are not going to work. Again, you can pay for a book blog tour, but I did some extensive research into what these tours look like for most places. Not all of them, but a lot of them are literally copy and pasting your articles to various bloggers. It's not going to get anyone interested in your book. If you're going to pay money, do it very wisely. The majority of self published authors will tell you that, as much as it sucks, Facebook advertising is probably one of the best ways to get your book in front of other readers while paying money. And you may not be a big fan of Facebook. I'm not either, but I have an author presence on there now as a future thing so that I can try this out for myself. because this is essentially one of those biggest things that I've heard. And as well as there are groups on Facebook specifically for marketing your kinds of fiction. I am part of several young adult writers groups because of my middle age novel, and it has given me several awesome opportunities. And people, again, don't seem to be afraid that I'm a furry. If anything, they embrace it, and it creates something wonderful. And I definitely want to read this comment by Francis Polly. If you have stories with domestic critters, both the Dog Writers of America and Cat Writers Association hold annual contests with fiction categories. Exactly. As I'm saying, there's so many stories that are open to this, and even within the guild, it's been something we've discussed about trying to reach out to more markets and going through like the submission grinder when we see new markets and things like that, and asking if they'd be open to furry stories. Because you would be surprised how easy it is to bring furry stories into the mix. Like, what about an anthology that talks about fairy tales? Animal characters are going to work just fine. It doesn't matter that this is a normal, non-furry anthology thing. You put it in, you give them your pitch, and you give it a go. I also see this as another wonderful thing for Zarpolis. There's an indie bookstore in my city that takes books by local authors on consignment. This is a thing you can do, and especially if you're a local author, talk to your local library. A little harder nowadays because of COVID, but you could probably get your book not only a part of their system, but on a special display for I am a local author. Go read my book, which is something else I tried to do, but that one was actually a little bit stopped by COVID. There was going to be some local readings, but of course, safety comes first, everybody. But these are all things that we can do. And again, as long as you're willing to not be so afraid of I'm a furry writer or this book definitely has anthropomorphic animals, definitely go for it. And because I only have about a minute left, I promise that right at the end I do a very brief talk about okay, Lynn, obviously my story involving werewolves boinking is probably not appropriate to market to a mainstream audience. And to that I'm going to say, you're wrong. Not just because werewolves, and we all know, let's face it, we're near Halloween, people like that kind of thing, but in general, when we look at animal characters, there is essentially the best way to put it enough of a monster genre or this is different genre that there is a good chance that your story, even if it is written to be more adult, can be marketed to a mainstream audience. You're going to have to be far more specific about this. I wouldn't, I mean, you could probably post this up to several like erotica book blogs and they again would be interested because you're furries. Um, and they're going to be like instantaneously going, I want to read about this. But you may want to find more niche things in those kinds of markets. Again, I joke about things like monsters and everything else. Obviously, an average furry animal is not a monster, but you may be able to find those markets that are also niche are going to completely latch onto your book.